The words struck me like a sudden, cold wind cutting through a thin coat, unexpected and unwelcome. My son announced they were going on a family vacation without me. The trip I had funded entirely. His voice was casual, almost dismissive, as if I were an afterthought rather than the one who had made everything possible. "We're leaving next week," he said, his tone flat, as though this was not a difficult conversation but a routine announcement. "It's better this way." I sat there, feeling the walls close in as the weight of humiliation settled deep inside. My mind reeled, struggling to make sense of the fact that they would take a pleasure I had provided myself and exclude me entirely. My daughter-in-law nodded silently from the corner, while their children laughed and chattered, completely unaware of the quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. It was a cruel irony. The innocence of the children's laughter clashed harshly with the sting of rejection that filled the room. Holding back on any immediate reaction, I kept my face neutral, though inside, a tumult of emotions raged. Years upon years of sacrifices, the late nights helping with schoolwork, the sleepless hours of worry, the financial help at critical moments flashed through my mind. I remembered paying off my son's college tuition when he couldn't, the house I bought for them to call home, the quiet withdrawals from my retirement savings to ensure they had opportunities I never had. All those acts of love and support rendered invisible by the cold dismissal I was now experiencing. But anger did not surge through me as I expected. Instead, there was a slow-burning bitterness that settled deep beneath a mask of calm. I had learned in my years as a bank executive how to control my emotions, how to maintain a measured demeanor no matter what storm was raging inside, how to protect myself with quiet patience. So I sat still, absorbing the shock, feeling the humiliation as a weight settling on my shoulders while I looked for something steady to hold on to. Finally, without a word, I rose from my chair. Every step away from the room felt heavy, like leaving a world that no longer held space for me. I heard the distant laughter of my grandchildren, their carefree voices a sharp contrast to the silence I carried within. It was a sound that should have comforted me, yet in this moment it only underscored my exclusion. I retreated to the sanctuary of my study, closing the door gently behind me. The quiet room welcomed me with familiar shadows and the scent of old books, a reminder of the years I had poured into building a life, into constructing a future for them all. Now that life felt fractured. The family I had spent decades supporting had chosen to exclude me from something joyous, something I orchestrated out of love and sacrifice. I sat alone, letting the harsh reality sink in fully. The humiliation was undeniable. But beneath it lay a new sensation, a flicker of resolve. I realized this wasn't just a passing wound caused by a careless slight. It was a deliberate affront, a dismissal that demanded a response. It ignited something deep within me, a quiet but fierce determination that this injustice would not go unanswered. The memory of their entitlement, the way they spoke as though my contributions were their birthright rather than a gift, pressed on my mind. I understood then that my next steps could not be impulsive or fueled by mere resentment. No, they required the careful planning, the strategic thinking honed over a lifetime in banking and finance. In my solitude, I began to gather that strength, patient, deliberate, methodical. I would let the sting of exclusion ferment into a resolve just as precise and unyielding. They had forgotten the foundation I laid beneath their lives and vacations. Now they would learn that foundation was neither fragile nor forgotten. That day, as the sun dipped outside my window and shadows lengthened across the floor, I closed the chapter their arrogance forced open, but only to start a new one on my own terms. Justice must be restored, and arrogance punished. I sat quietly, no longer the man who would silently endure, but one who would prepare to reclaim what had always belonged to him. In the stillness of my study, the memories came unbidden, each one a reminder of the years I had poured into building their lives. I found myself replaying moments of quiet sacrifice, Nights when money was tight, but I made sure my son's tuition was covered without question. The worry behind those decisions thrummed beneath my skin still, a reminder of the burdens I carried so they wouldn't have to. I thought of the family home, the place I had worked so hard to secure, negotiating the mortgage with patience and care, ensuring every detail was in order so that the roof over their heads would be stable and secure. Those bricks and mortar represented more than shelter. They were a testament to the life I endeavored to build for them, one grounded in opportunity and hope. Yet now, I was excluded from a vacation I had funded entirely. A trip meant to bring them joy, yet I was left out, a silent observer to their careless enjoyment. The sting of this reality cut deep. Their entitlement, once invisible to me, was now glaring and undeniable. My years of generosity had become their expectation, my sacrifices seen not as acts of love, but as dues of birthright. I held on to the weight of their ingratitude, letting it settle like an ache I couldn't ignore. Their dismissive tones, the missed acknowledgments, and the cold distance in their voices surfaced clearly in my mind. It was a pain rooted not just in exclusion, but in betrayal of the trust and care I had given so freely. But beneath the hurt, a firmer resolve grew. I realized this wound was more than a cut from carelessness. It was a deliberate slight that demanded a response, not one of anger or rashness, but of steady, calculated determination. I was not the man to lash out without thought. My decades spent navigating the complexities of banking and finance had taught me the power of patience and precision. My experience had given me an arsenal of skills, knowledge of contracts, legal systems, and financial intricacies that I intended to use. What once helped me build a secure future for them would now serve as my tool for restoring balance. I would become the strategist, the chess player moving pieces unseen, but inevitably. I remembered whispers I'd overheard about debts accumulating, business troubles buried under confident brags, and financial missteps hidden behind a veneer of success. I imagined sifting through the papers, the statements, the agreements, each a thread waiting to be pulled to unravel their false sense of independence. I acknowledged that this path had to be taken with care. Destruction done without control could harm the family and the fragile respect that remained. I vowed to act with deliberation and patience, enlisting trusted professionals, lawyers with estate expertise, old acquaintances respectful of my resolve, financial experts who valued integrity. The plan would be quiet at first, a subtle tightening of the noose around their complacency. I would not reveal my hand prematurely, nor seek confrontation for confrontation's sake. Every move would be calculated, every step precise, to ensure the reckoning was unavoidable and just. Yet, as I mapped out this approach, my thoughts lingered on the grandchildren, innocents who deserved better than the turmoil they might inherit. My feelings for them added complexity to my strategy, but also reinforced my resolve. This was a necessary reckoning, a restoration not just for me, but for the future they deserved. The silence of the study offered clarity. I was no longer the man who endured quietly, passive and overshadowed. I was becoming a guardian of justice, armed with knowledge and unwavering purpose. This was more than personal grievance. It was a confrontation with values, respect, accountability, and the consequences of neglect. As the night deepened, I felt a calm before the storm, a steady readiness forged not in impulsive fury, but in the quiet power of years of experience and care. The foundation I had built for them, forgotten and unacknowledged, was not fragile. It was the cornerstone on which I would rise. No longer would their arrogance go unchallenged. I would gather every fact, every document, every piece of leverage to reclaim what was rightfully mine, not just for justice's sake, but to restore the dignity that had been stripped away. The journey ahead would be long and painstaking, but I was prepared to walk it with patience and precision. My sacrifices had been many, and though the pain of this betrayal was deep, it would fuel my resolve. I would restore balance, slowly and meticulously, The house, the investments, the very fabric of this family's illusion of independence would be tested, and they would learn that beneath their entitlement lay a force not to be underestimated. In that quiet room, surrounded by the things I had built, I made a final silent vow. This was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. I would reclaim my place, not with noise or rage, but with the unyielding strength of a man who knew the value of patience, strategy, and justice. Their arrogance would be met with consequences. Their disregard would be answered with unshakable resolve. And through it all, I would stand firm, finally ready to reclaim what had always been mine. Weeks slipped by with a slow, deliberate cadence, each day folding into the next as I sat apart, watching from a distance. I did not need to be physically present to sense the widening gulf between us. Their lives went on, uninterrupted and heedless, brimming with laughter from which I was deliberately absent. Then came the moment the cold truth crystallized, the moment I had sensed but could scarcely believe until it unfolded before me. I caught my son on the phone, his voice brimming with arrogance and careless pride as he recounted the pleasures of their trip to a distant relative. The lake, the fishing, the dinners, all painted in vivid detail, none acknowledging the man who had put it all within reach. It was as if I did not exist, a ghost to their jubilance. His dismissive words, laced with scorn, as he reiterated how this was a grown-up affair, their independence without my presence, cut through the quiet of my sanctuary like a blade. The finality of that exclusion awakened a new resolve within me. The bitterness I had carried transformed into a focus sharp and unyielding. This was no longer mere family discord. It was a calculated power play, a willful dismissal disguised by casual indifference. It was an affront not to be left unanswered. I accepted the truth. Emotional appeals would be wasted on their hardened ears and stubborn hearts. Their entitlement was entrenched, immune to reason or kindness. To meet them on their chosen battlefield, I had to abandon sentiment and adopt the cold precision of the strategist I had long buried beneath years of silent endurance. My years in banking had trained me to see systems beneath chaos, patterns beneath noise. I began constructing a mental map of their financial world, business ventures fraught with risk, rumors of unpaid creditors, contractual pitfalls overlooked or ignored. Bits of overheard conversations, snippets of documents glimpsed, formed the threads of a tapestry I was determined to unravel. I resolved to gather evidence, to illuminate the shadows they sought to hide behind. This necessitated patience and discretion, a slow, methodical examination of public records, financial statements, and contractual obligations. I would wield this knowledge not recklessly, but with calibrated intent to expose vulnerabilities masked by bluster and bravado. Their so-called independence was an illusion propped up by ignorance and hubris. They clung to a fragile web of loans and liabilities, unaware that each misstep would tighten the net I was carefully spinning. Their confidence, once impenetrable, had cracks that only time and careful observation could reveal. Strategizing several moves ahead, I contemplated their possible reactions: denial, anger, attempts at obfuscation. I designed contingencies to counter each, ensuring that my position would remain unassailable regardless of their desperation. The stakes were high, the risks real. Yet I was fortified by the certainty that my righteous claim demanded careful execution rather than impetuous action. Despite the cold logic guiding me, I did not discount the personal cost. This was not merely financial or strategic, it was deeply emotional.
For decades, I had invested love and sacrifice into this family, only to be met with disdain. That ache lingered like a shadow, a reminder of what had been lost. Yet pity had no place here. The preservation of dignity and justice mandated firm resolve. I could no longer be a silent enabler of arrogance. Without intervention, the erosion of respect would continue unchecked, inflicting deeper wounds upon the legacy I had labored to create. They persisted in their unquestioned confidence, oblivious to the quiet examination I imposed. Conversations about prosperity, independence, and self-sufficiency betrayed no hint of the looming reckoning. But I noted every slip, every inconsistency, every overlooked obligation that might be leveraged to restore balance. Their children remained innocent, shielded in carefree ignorance, a fact both heartening and painful. I wished to protect them from fallout, yet understood that the consequences of their parents' follies were inevitable.
My fatherly instincts conflicted with the necessity of the course I had set. In public, I maintained a composed front, revealing nothing of the storm brewing beneath. When cornered, I replied with calm brevity, each word measured to expose their impetuousness without illuminating the depth of my preparations. Their mounting frustration was palpable. They were unraveling, yet blind to the source. Gradually, the family dynamic shifted. The once confident smiles tightened into tense lines, their swagger mutating into tentative uncertainty. Their attempts to regain control only accelerated their descent as financial strains and legal vulnerabilities surfaced. My quiet campaign was an unrelenting force bearing down on their fragile sameness. The slow erosion of their security was a victory in itself, a dismantling measured and deliberate, not loud or vindictive, but undeniably effective. Amid the strategizing, moments of reflection surfaced on the irony that my decades of generosity had bred such disregard, and that the man who had given so much now waged a battle to reclaim respect. The transformation from provider to tactician came with a price, yet was necessary for survival and closure. The line between forgiveness and enabler had long ago been crossed. The time had come for decisive action. I would right the imbalance not through strife, but through unassailable evidence and relentless patience. The path ahead demanded vigilance and steadfastness. The threads I tugged began revealing patterns of recklessness and neglect wrapped in entitlement. My efforts contrived to unravel these, exposing fault lines beneath superficial strength. I became an unseen hand guiding consequences to their doorstep, a force they could neither ignore nor counter. Their presumption had blinded them to my quiet preparedness and unshakable resolve. The era of silent endurance was over. Now came the period of strategic reclamation, a campaign that would restore dignity through intellect and perseverance. They would learn that the foundation on which they stood, the foundation I had built, was far stronger and more resilient than their arrogance had allowed. I was ready for every move ahead, unflinching in resolve, calm in mind, and unwavering in purpose. The reckoning, long awaited, was finally at hand. I dove headfirst into the investigation, the sanctuary of my study becoming a war room, maps and documents cluttering the once orderly desk. The quiet I'd grown accustomed to was punctuated only by the sharp rustle of papers and the steady scratch of my pen. I sifted through bank statements, scrutinized tax returns, and pored over contracts like a detective combing for clues. Every number, every signature, every clause could hide a weakness, a fault line in the seemingly impenetrable fortress my son and daughter-in-law had built. I called upon an old friend, Margaret, a seasoned estate lawyer whose prudence and discretion were legendary. Margaret had accompanied me through countless financial storms over the years, always providing clarity and the sharp edge of legal wisdom. I knew I could trust her completely, not just professionally, but personally. Our conversations were careful, coded at times, navigating the delicate terrain of family and finance. Together, we began untangling the knotted web of assets, debts, and legal commitments that constituted their business and personal lives. It became clear quickly that the picture they painted for themselves and their peers was one of optimism but fiction. Promises and contracts remained unfulfilled, investments were pledged but funds diverted, Loans were repaid with borrowed money from new creditors. The veneer of success masked a precarious balance sheet hiding serious liabilities. The first vulnerability appeared in the form of an overlooked real estate lien attached to a commercial property my son had invested in without informing anyone. It was a small detail, buried in layers of paperwork and legalese, but it opened doors. Alongside Margaret, I devised strategies to leverage such oversights, knowing that exposure, even of minor infractions, would unsettle their confidence and restrict their financial freedom. I meticulously documented everything, turning whispers into evidence, overhears into substance. One misstep I uncovered was a loan guarantee given without proper collateral, a reckless risk that left them exposed if circumstances shifted. I smiled grimly, realizing these were exactly the kinds of cracks I needed to exploit, patiently building pressure points. Simultaneously, I reached out discreetly to a long-trusted accountant, Frank, a man who had once worked under my guidance and was known for his ethical backbone and attention to detail. Preserve the original language of the text, parsing through the jumble of accounts, revealing irregularities and cash flow troubles that explained the tight grip on their sometimes frayed finances. His reports affirmed my suspicions. They were teetering on the edge of insolvency in areas they would never admit to in polite circles. With these insights, I drew up a layered, multi-pronged plan: legal maneuvers, asset betterment, careful reallocation of resources, and precise interventions designed to disrupt their illusion of independence without dismantling the foundation entirely. The plan was not to destroy, but to recalibrate, to realign their understanding with reality and compel accountability. Every move required subtlety. A rushed or overt act risked alienating them beyond repair or triggering desperate reactions that could backfire. Hence, patience was as crucial as precision. Like a surgeon, I identified each vulnerable artery, mapping incision points for optimal effect. I also recognized the value in preserving appearances where possible. Maintaining their dignity, even as I eroded their unchecked arrogance, was essential to avoid irreparable family breaking. I hoped this would allow room for eventual reconciliation, or at least mutual respect once true independence proved elusive. The first phase involved redirecting discretionary funds, those accounts they used for personal indulgences, vacations, and luxuries. I quietly intervened through appropriate legal channels to freeze or restrict these without immediate alarm. It was a small but symbolic gesture, a tightening of control that went unnoticed at first and planted seeds of unease. At the same time, I sent notifications via Margaret regarding obligations and regulatory compliance that would require their immediate attention. These letters were professional but pointed, highlighting overlooked liabilities and demanding swift action. The goal was to introduce a sense of urgency to realities they had happily ignored. As these initial measures took hold, I monitored their responses closely. Their facade of confidence began to falter under the weight of bureaucratic demands and tightened spending. Frustration seeped into conversations I intercepted or overheard. Anxiety crackled just beneath aggressive reassurances. In private, they sought counsel and tried quietly to remedy deficiencies I had uncovered, but their efforts were often reactive and insufficient. Lack of coordinated strategy left them exposed and vulnerable. Each misstep I noticed and cataloged carefully for future action. Margaret and I met often, discussing next steps, refining tactics based on new information and their reactions. I ensured our communications were discreet, aware of the delicate balance between assertiveness and prudence. Meanwhile, Frank provided ongoing financial assessments that informed energy and timing. His insights illuminated where they were most susceptible: cash flow bottlenecks, outstanding debts approaching default, contractual obligations likely to trigger penalties. These insights shaped the second wave of interventions. Parallel to these efforts, I initiated careful measures to reclaim portions of the estate and business assets under my name or influence. It was a quiet, bureaucratic dance,
transferring titles, registering liens, and asserting control through formal channels, each step cataloged and executed with legal precision. Despite the complexity and potential for conflict, I remained detached, focusing on the long game and the ultimate goal, to restore balance and command respect rather than seek revenge. I had no desire to crush the family. My intent was clear: justice, restitution, and the reestablishment of honor. As weeks turned into months, the cumulative effect became tangible. Restrictions on accounts led to halted expenses. Delayed payments triggered supplier inquiries, and mounting pressure from third parties threatened to unravel their constructed illusion. Their complacency was shattered incrementally. Late notices arrived, calls from creditors increased, and legal counsel shifted from confident to defensive. Behind closed doors, tension rose palpably. I sensed their panic and denial, but maintained careful distance, observing the most effective pressure points. Throughout, I guarded my own emotions fiercely. The pain of exclusion and betrayal remained a quiet ember, fueling resolve but not clouding judgment. Every action was measured and calculated, grounded on principle rather than passion. At times, the isolation of this campaign was profound. I had stepped beyond the role of father and benefactor into that of strategist and adversary, a position fraught with loneliness and steel resolve. Yet I understood it was necessary.
Perhaps the only way to restore balance and dignity when goodwill failed. The ultimate test would be in their response when the full scope became undeniable. Would they accept accountability or dig in deeper? The outcome was uncertain, but my preparations left little room for evasion. In quiet moments, I reflected on the irony. The very knowledge and patience I had cultivated through decades of silent sacrifice would now serve as the instrument of their reckoning. The foundation I had so carefully built was no longer solely a source of support, but a means of correction. Each document I reviewed, every legal letter sent, and each financial restriction placed was a stone laid in the pathway towards justice. A pathway forged not in vengeance, but in resolution and the quiet assertion of rightful authority. I knew the road ahead would be long and fraught, but as the plans unfolded with steady progress, I felt a deep sense of purpose. I was no longer merely the man who had been cast aside. I was the force orchestrating a change they could not ignore. In the depths of the night, as the city beyond slept unaware, I sat surrounded by paperwork and plans, the weight of responsibility balanced against the certainty of impending justice. The quiet before the storm was over. The execution of the plan had begun. The day I enacted the first phase of my plan began like any other, the soft morning light filtering through the curtains, concealing the storm I was about to unleash. I moved with quiet precision, each choice calculated, deliberate. A man who had spent a lifetime ensuring no detail went unnoticed, no risk unmanaged. The previous months of preparation had laid the groundwork. Now it was time for action. The initial move was subtle, freezing discretionary accounts tied to their personal spending. These accounts, once abundant with funds for vacations, indulgences, and luxuries, were now suddenly restricted through formal legal channels. The bank complied without fanfare, honor-bound to follow legal requests, leaving my son and daughter-in-law blindsided by the frozen funds when they tried to make routine purchases. At first, they thought it a mere banking error, but as days passed without resolution, confusion grew into a quiet, creeping panic. With the accounts frozen, I halted allowances and funds that had previously been extended to maintain their vibrant lifestyle. This was not a gut reaction. It was a strategic tightening of the financial reins, sent through Margaret's legal office with precise wording to maintain professionalism but assure compliance. The message was clear. Resources were no longer unlimited, and I was the gatekeeper. Simultaneously, formal notifications arrived regarding debts and obligations long rumored but never addressed. Letters from creditors, notices of overdue payments, and compliance requests landed systematically, causing a surge of anxiety within their inner circle.
These notifications bore my firm's hallmark discretion, but were unambiguous in tone, urgent, legal, and demanding. I wanted to rattle the gilded cage they lived in without burning it to the ground. From a distance, I watched their reaction unfold. The confident exterior they projected began to crack. Phone calls I intercepted revealed rising stress, whispered fears, and frustrated arguments. I overheard my son chastising his wife over their financial predicament, his voice tinged with anger and desperation, rare cracks in the armor that once seemed impenetrable. In their attempts to regain control, they turned to old friends and advisors, grappling with the sudden restrictions and liabilities. But their efforts were reactive, disjointed, and lacked the foresight necessary to stem the tide closing in on them.
Each attempt to stabilize was met with fresh revelations of overlooked debts or contractual penalties. My responses during occasional confrontations were terse and measured. When they accused me directly, their words sharp and laced with disbelief, I maintained a calm, impassive demeanor. I neither defended nor vilified. I merely cited facts, letting the cold truth hang in the space between us. Their frustration deepened as they realized that their impetuousness had been their undoing. Gradually, the family dynamic shifted perceptibly. The casual, dismissive tone they once directed at me gave way to guarded conversation and cautious glances when I entered a room. They sensed the change, even if they could not fully grasp its source or magnitude. Their previous sense of entitlement gave way to a hollow uncertainty. In the midst of this upheaval, I remained constant, a silent, unwavering force. My moves were methodical, applied with the steady hand of experience rather than the rashness of anger. Each document submitted, every legal step taken, was carefully recorded and indexed to maintain unassailable legitimacy. Their unraveling served as a vindication not of bitterness but of necessity. It pained me to see the fractures within the family widen, yet I knew that without this reckoning, their arrogance would only worsen, corroding the bonds further and erasing what remained of respect. Behind closed doors, I kept to my study, often late into the night, reviewing responses, recalibrating strategies, and consulting with Margaret and Frank. With their combined expertise, each subsequent move was sharpened to exacting precision, ensuring maximum impact with minimal collateral damage. The unexpected fissures appeared where I least anticipated. Loose clauses in contracts, overlooked regulatory responsibilities, even minor discrepancies in tax filings. These details, tiny in isolation, accumulated into a mosaic of vulnerability that eroded their confidence and financial standing. Each bit of evidence and every legal letter sent added pressure, creating a network of challenges too complex and dangerous to ignore. Delays in payments triggered penalties. Inspections and audits scrutinized their operation. Suppliers and partners began to question their reliability. The luxury of obliviousness was no longer afforded. Their children remained largely insulated from the turmoil, a bittersweet comfort that reminded me why this had to be done with care and restraint. I wanted to preserve what innocence remained, shield them from the fallout of adult folly whenever possible. Despite the mounting tension, I maintained my stoic exterior even as the internal weight grew heavier. The isolation was profound, transformed from the man who once provided quietly to the man orchestrating a confrontation that many would consider cold or ruthless. Yet, it was a necessary metamorphosis demanded by betrayal and the need for justice. I wrestled with this duality, the tenderness of a father conflicting with the rigor of a strategist. In my solitude, I found no joy in their suffering, only the somber satisfaction of reclaiming lost respect and asserting rightful authority. The battle was far from over. The restrictions, the pressures, the revelations, they were but the opening salvo in a longer game. I anticipated resistance, their attempts to regroup, fight back, and perhaps even lash out. My preparations accounted for this. Contingencies awaited activation at a moment's notice. As their world contracted under financial scrutiny, their confidence eroded, giving way to desperation. In conversations I caught, the language shifted from denial to worry, then to fear. The question was no longer whether they could maintain their lifestyle, but how long they could sustain the facade. The transformation was underway. The comfortable illusion of independence was unraveling, replaced by the harsh reckoning reality imposed by the one they had scorned most. Throughout this, I remained unshaken, my mind a reservoir of patience and strategy. I was no longer the passive victim cast aside. I was the force reshaping the narrative, orchestrating the downfall of arrogance with calculated grace. In the quiet of the night, with the weight of decisions pressing on me, I found clarity. The road ahead would be arduous and fraught with challenge, but the restoration of balance compelled me forward. This was more than ground reclaimed, it was dignity restored. The fight was not loud or public, it was a steady, relentless assertion of truth and accountability. And as they grappled with the unfolding reality, I prepared for the moments ahead, when the full scope of their reckoning would become undeniable and irreversible. I had walked a long road from silent provider to strategic foe,
Preserved the original father to architect of justice. Now every move counted, every detail mattered, and the execution of my plan was well underway. The quiet before the storm was over. The reckoning had begun. The night of reckoning arrived with a stillness that belied the storm it carried. The house was alive with subdued conversations, smiles that seemed rehearsed, and eyes that darted with unease behind polite facades. I stepped inside, carrying with me the weight of months of preparation, the quiet resolve that had sustained me through the long hours of reflection and planning. This was the moment when silence would break, when truth would pierce the veneer and expose what had been hidden beneath years of greed and disregard. The familiar surroundings, once a sanctuary of warmth and shared memories, now felt charged with tension, an invisible current humming beneath each greeting and subdued laughter. Faces I had known all my life glanced my way with a mix of apprehension and skepticism, unsure what to expect from the man they had dismissed for so long. But I was no longer the same man who quietly endured the slights and exclusions. I was transformed, steady, and unyielding. As the evening unfolded, the usual pleasantries gave way to a heavier atmosphere. I watched carefully, noting the subtle shifts, the tightening of jaws, the fleeting glances, the restless movements. I felt the invisible walls closing in, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on the room. It was time. With measured calm, I stood and addressed the gathered family. My voice was steady, carrying the weight of years filled with quiet sacrifice and steadfast support. I began to speak of the things too long left unsaid, the sacrifices made silently, the financial burdens I had borne to secure their futures, the love that had gone unacknowledged. I recounted the late nights paying tuition fees, the sleepless concerns over mortgages and debts, the vacations I funded for their happiness only to be excluded from the joy I had helped create. I laid before them evidence painstakingly gathered, a trove of documents, financial statements, legal notices that painted an unvarnished picture of mismanagement and reckless entitlement. I detailed the accumulation of debts, the careless decisions, the contracts signed without due diligence, and the mounting liabilities hidden beneath layers of false confidence. Their expressions shifted from polite attentiveness to disbelief, then to the dawning recognition of the precarious position they had ignored. Voices stammered to offer excuses, justifications rooted in denial or deflection, but I met each with calm facts and unassailable clarity. My words were not accusations, but calls to accountability, appeals to principles long neglected.
The vacation, once a symbol of my generosity, now stood as the stark emblem of their ingratitude. The trip I had paid for, from which I had been deliberately excluded. It was not just a matter of hurt feelings. It was a demonstration of their arrogance and disrespect, a wound that demanded redress. Questions arose, tentative at first, then more urgent. My son's voice faltered between defensiveness and dawning acceptance, while my daughter-in-law's silence spoke volumes. The grandchildren, sensing the shift but not yet understanding, shifted uneasily. The family balance tilted, the comfortable patterns disrupted irrevocably. I explained the consequences I had set in motion: frozen accounts, halted allowances, legal notices demanding attention. These were not acts of vengeance, but necessary measures to impose order where chaos had reigned. I emphasized the choice before them: to acknowledge responsibility and embark on the path to restitution, or continue denial at a costly price. The room grew heavy with silence, the atmosphere thick with the weight of truth. The ease of family warmth was replaced by the cold clarity of reckoning. I saw in their eyes the reality of the situation settling in, the crumbling of illusions once taken for granted. In the days that followed, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Encounters grew cautious. Conversations bristled with unspoken grievances and tentative hopes. I maintained my steady presence, neither conciliatory nor confrontational, but resolute and measured. The fractured family faced the consequences of pride and neglect. Their social standing wavered under whispered scrutiny. Resources tightened, and with each financial constraint, the facade of independence cracked further. Their attempts at recovery were hampered by the very structures they had neglected to uphold. I found solace in the knowledge that justice often came not with explosions of anger, but with steady, unrelenting pressure. The battle was neither loud nor flamboyant, but meticulous and sure. I had not sought to destroy, but to rebuild, to realign respect where it had been eroded. Loneliness accompanied me, the isolation of the one who had crossed lines no one wished to cross, but whom necessity dictated must be crossed. I wrestled with the duality of my roles, a father seeking connection and a strategist demanding accountability. The internal conflict was a quiet burden, but one I embraced as the price of dignity. Late nights were spent in reflection and planning, considering each emerging challenge, anticipating resistance, and preparing responses. Every detail mattered, for in the delicate balance of family and finance, a single misstep could unravel all. Yet I remained unshaken, driven by the certainty that true restoration required courage, patience, and unwavering resolve. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with hardship, but it was the only path to reclaiming honor and rebuilding fractured bonds. The night air outside calmed my thoughts as I walked home from those disrupted gatherings, the city lights casting long shadows on forgotten streets. I felt no bitterness, only a profound sense of purpose. The reckoning was not merely a conclusion, but a commencement, a turning point towards a future where respect could be restored and dignity reclaimed. I thought of the grandchildren, innocent and untainted, who deserved a family reborn from truth rather than facades. My hope lay in them, in the possibility that this storm would clear the air for new beginnings. The foundation I had laid for decades was no longer taken for granted, but reinvigorated with meaning and respect earned through hardship. I was no longer sidelined, but central, a force of steady conviction and quiet authority. As dawn broke and cast pale light over weary streets, I embraced the stillness that follows the storm. The reckoning had begun in earnest, and though the path was arduous, I stepped forward with a heart tempered by resolve and a mind clear with purpose. This was justice, not loud or vengeful, but firm and restorative. And as the pieces moved inexorably toward balance, I stood ready, unbowed and unwavering, to reclaim what was always mine. In the quiet that followed the storm of confrontation,
I sat alone in the familiar embrace of my study, the soft lamplight casting long shadows across the worn pages of books that had accompanied me through decades of both triumph and hardship. The air felt different now, lighter, though tinged with the residue of wounds freshly inflicted and still healing. It was a peace born not of victory, but of resolution, the relief that comes from standing firm, claiming what is right, and knowing the battle, at last, had been truly joined and met head-on. The journey to this moment had stretched long and difficult, filled with silent sacrifices and the weight of unspoken regrets. I reflected on the man I had been, the quiet provider who bore unacknowledged burdens, the father whose love had too often been met with indifference or worse. But in the aftermath, I realized I was no longer that man. I had become something resolute and rare, a guardian of justice within my own family, a strategist whose measured patience and steadfast resolve had carved out a space for dignity and respect. Yet, even as a sense of peace grew, I understood the path ahead was not simple or assured. The fractures in those I loved were deep, and the hope for repair rested on fragile ground. Forgiveness is a slow and uneven journey, requiring more than words. It demands humility, understanding, and time. I knew the wounds inflicted by exclusion and arrogance could not be undone overnight, nor would every relationship be mended. But healing was possible, and the first steps toward it had been taken. The thoughts often returned to the grandchildren, the young souls at the heart of the family, untouched by the bitterness that had crept between the adults. Their innocence was both a balm and a call to responsibility. I wished for them not just the survival of family ties, but the rebirth of values, respect where there had been entitlement, gratitude in place of disregard, and love grounded in mutual support rather than expectation. They deserved a legacy shaped by truth and honor, not shadows and silence. In the days that followed, I embraced a renewed independence. Freed from the weight of unreciprocated sacrifices, I focused on cultivating a life defined on my own terms. The simple rhythms of daily living, a morning walk beneath awakening skies, the quiet satisfaction of a well-read book, the company of trusted friends who knew the contour of my life, became sources of restoration. These moments of solitude were not loneliness, but reclamations of self, a reaffirmation of the strength that had carried me through. Memories lingered, of late nights spent worrying over financial decisions, of sacrifices made without fanfare, and of joys shared even when unacknowledged. They were a tapestry woven with threads of love and loss, complexity and clarity. Though the past could not be rewritten, it was a foundation from which I could build anew. I noticed subtle changes rippling through the family over time. Some walls lowered, tentative bridges were extended, cautious conversations replaced silence and avoidance. Not all barriers fell, nor were all wounds healed, but the possibility of connection sparked quietly in the spaces where bitterness had once thrived. I welcomed these fragile beginnings without expectation, understanding that true reconciliation is a process, not an event. Through it all, one unshakable truth settled in my heart. I had built this life for them once, investing time, love, and resources with an open heart. Now, preserve the original language of calm dignity and unwavering resolve, I would build what remained of my world anew, on my own terms, with a strength born of experience and self-respect. The past no longer defined me, it informed me. I was not a victim of betrayal, but a man renewed by resolve, transformed by the trials endured. I had shed the mantle of silent endurance to become a man who stood firm, quietly powerful, patient, and just. As the seasons moved forward, I welcomed the dawn of each day with gratitude for the peace that had returned, tempered by the knowledge that life's complexities would continue to unfold. The journey toward full restoration was long,
possibly incomplete, but neither fear nor doubt could sway me now. In solitude or company, I carried a quiet triumph, a victory not loud or boastful, but profound and enduring, the triumph of reclaimed dignity, the power of principled resolve, and the hope of renewal yet to come.